Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon, and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Hello everyone, welcome to a session on inequality and exploitation from Plato to the neoliberal times, and as two of the representatives of neoliberalism, neoliberal thinkers of the 20th century, I have decided to include Friedrich Hayek and one of the major ideologues and promoters of the ideology of neoliberalism, and the other, of course, is Milton Friedman of the University of Chicago. This topic is vast, as you can imagine, because the issue of equality and inequality is one that has, in fact, consumed scholars and the laymen and religious figures, theologians, and so forth, as we will see by looking at a sample of some of these people from ancient times and ancient religions to the present. We have for today an introduction to the topic. I'm going to start with a brief introduction going to the nature of inequality, the varieties of inequality and exploitation. And then we will proceed with Plato and Aristotle, two ancient Greek philosophers who dealt with the issue. Plato, in fact, was the first philosopher to deal with this issue in the Republic, a utopian vision of the ideal society. And of course, his student, Aristotle, did the same thing. He also dealt with it. And then we're going to move on to some major religions, very briefly from an overview perspective. Hinduism, Confucianism, Islam, and Christianity. Look at how they approached the issue of equality. And then we are also going to move on. I'm going to discuss specifically St. Augustine. St. Augustine was a major theologian of the early Middle Ages. In fact, I should disclose for obvious reasons, it's a good idea to do this, that I, decades ago, needless to point out, I actually did my master thesis on St. Augustine's The City of God, his major work, and the Confessions being the other one. But St. Augustine was a prolific writer, by the way, although he converted to Christianity at a very late age. He nevertheless wrote a great deal. Let me begin by pointing out that from the time of civilized society, in other words, and I pointed this from Mesopotamia, in other words, and I pointed this out in many sessions of videos before, from about 3,500 years, 3,500 BC, in other words, 5,500 years ago. That's the origin of civilization in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, to the present. The fact is that hierarchies and elites have been a fixture uh, through the institutional structure, both public and private. The great French thinker Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose work, by the way, we are going to look at very briefly, and his views of equality and exploitation, began his study, the social contract, by stating that man is born free and everywhere he's in chains. Now, Rousseau influenced profoundly thinkers of the last 200 years. What did he mean, man is born free and everywhere he's in chains? He lived in the 18th century. He assumed that before civilization, human beings enjoyed a certain sense of equality and freedom from exploitation, institutional, both public and private, not just public, not just private, both. Jean-Jacques Rousseau lived in 18th century France. There was an absolutist regime. At the end of the 18th century, of course, there was a revolution to bring that regime down. That was the end of that regime. By the way, the French Revolution did bring it down. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau had an enormous influence, even in his own time. He influenced Thomas Jefferson in the United States and the concept of Jeffersonian democracy, and Thomas Jefferson's views of what constituted equality and mitigating methods to mitigate lessen exploitation. This issue is, in fact, very, very important. Most thinkers, by the way, from Plato to down to our own time, to, as I pointed out, to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, most thinkers do not come out and celebrate inequality and exploitation. Far from it, even if they advocate elitism, that is hierarchy in society, in the social structure, even if they advocate, as we will see today, that women and certain social classes are inferior to others, women to men, the poor to the rich, and so forth, they certainly do not come out. Rarely have them come out and yes, exploitation is a good thing, or an inequality is a good thing. Very rarely does that happen. One of the advocates who implied that inequality is built into the system in a very rather cynical way was Niccolo Machiavelli, the Italian political philosopher, who in The Prince adopted a very cynical view, making certain assumptions about human nature, rather negative assumptions, that human beings are innately predisposed toward doing things badly. You can't really trust human beings. This was, in fact, a view that also the British philosopher, the English philosopher, Thomas Hobbes had in the 17th century after Machiavelli. So the assumption that philosophers have had throughout history about the assumptions that they have had about human nature, when you read their political philosophy, what you'll find is that they reach conclusions reflecting the assumptions. For example, if the assumption is that human beings are not to be trusted, there is an innate evil in them. For the Christians, of course, due to original sin, then the government that they recommend is best suited is one that regiments human beings, meaning an authoritarian sort of regime. So this is not surprising. Throughout history, very few thinkers have, and we'll look at some of them even today. For example, today we will look at Sir Thomas More, the English thinker who wrote a book called Utopia and was a contemporary of Thomas Müntzer in Germany, who from a theological background. He also believed, he also was one of the exceptions. He believed in ending exploitation. He believed in an egalitarian society. Now, interestingly, by the way, I should point out with Thomas More, I would be remiss if I didn't, that he had the typical views of his period with regard to women, that women, of course, were inferior. We'll see from ancient times to some of the modern times. This was the view. Now, let me point out that it's not until the 18th century, until Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and thereafter, especially in the 19th century with Marx and Engels, the socialists, the anarchists, the syndicalists, that we actually do have philosophers advocating an egalitarian and idealistic egalitarian society, and ways to end exploitation, if at least not mitigate it. So this is the situation. The only other thing I want to point out here is that in the post-Enlightenment era, there is one group of intellectuals, namely neoliberals, since the 1930s, the late 1930s, when they emerged and really become prominent since the Thatcher-Reagan era. That group of people not only advocate inequality and see no problem with the exploitation that follows, but they actually celebrate hierarchy. They celebrate elitism, and they castigate egalitarianism. And we will discuss that group of people, that group of intellectuals in the next session, in part 2 of this topic. Now, the question of the philosophical question of, is there anything innate in human nature that points toward elitism and hierarchies and exploitation? Clearly, there have been thinkers who argue that this is not the case, because before civilization, this is not how human beings lived in the state of nature. That there was, in fact, communitarian way of living in an egalitarian setting. So institutions, public and private institutions, with the state as the catalyst, are to this day, have been historically, since Sumeria 5,500 years ago, they are the key to institutional inequality and institutional exploitation. So that's what we want to look at. One other thing before I go on to Plato, and that is, even if we take the view of many philosophers throughout history and theologians, that human beings are by nature unequal. And clearly, no one disputes that human beings are different. That's not the issue. That there is a diversity of human beings on this planet as a species. That's not the issue. No one disputes that human beings have different talents in different areas. That's not an issue. The question here is, should there be institutionalized exploitation and institutionalized inequality, and that inequality, institutionalized inequality, becoming part of the hegemonic culture, used to marginalize groups of people deemed inferior or at a lower level in society, whether it's in the caste system of India or in the West with the serfs during the Middle Ages, or the working class in the 21st century, or minorities in a country where, for example, in the Western countries where there are varieties of minority populations. So the question is, should that be used as a pretext to discriminate? It was certainly used to enslave millions of Africans, to transport them, first of all, from the African continent. The Europeans did that, obviously, to transport them to the Western Hemisphere. This doesn't mean, because I'm sure someone is probably thinking, watching this, well, the Arabs conducted the slave trade. Yes, they did, but there was no racialized element and inferiority issue involved. By the way, so did the ancient Greeks and the Romans, for that matter. Again, no racial component to this. So should people, should governments and institutions, private institutions, use issues like race and ethnicity and religion and gender to manufacture inequality and to exploit segments, large segments of the population? Because the vast majority, as I'm sure everyone knows, are not part of the elites. They are part of the marginalized on this planet. Of the 8 billion people, roughly 800 million control most of the assets. The rest of the population is relegated to a lesser role. Okay, obviously at different levels. So inequality is a very important issue to this day. Never mind the rhetoric by governments, by politicians, by the media, insisting that there is equality in so-called democratic countries, which of course have all kinds of laws and policies, from fiscal and monetary policy, which creates and perpetuates inequality, to immigration policy, to social policy, social safety net policies, and so forth. Never mind that. The fact is that the culture itself is poisoned. The culture itself is poisoned by the inequality and exploitation components injected uh, by the elites so that they retain their privileged role in society. Now, let me begin with Plato, and as I begin with Plato, one of the great philosophers of the Western world, of the entire world actually, great thinker, let me point out that philosophers throughout history have not had an impact in determining inequality and exploitation and the social structure and hierarchy. That's not the case. The fact is, they may reflect, like neoliberal thinkers reflect, the status quo, and insofar as they reflect the status quo and the interests of the status quo, their ideas are used by the elites to maintain and to justify their interests. But it does not mean that these people, that namely philosophers and theologians, as we will discuss today, as well as tomorrow, that these people are the ones determining the social order. The social order is determined independently by the social contract, by the mode of production, and we will delve more into this. Now, let me move on to, actually, before I go on to, well, I was going to give some statistics on inequality on a global scale, but I already alluded to the fact that about 800 million out of 8 billion people own most of the wealth. About 4 billion, I just one more, and then I do promise to go on to Plato. About 4 billion people on this planet live on less than $5.50, while those 800 million enjoy the vast majority of the wealth, far more than the bottom 90% of the world's population. There are all kinds, by the way, in case people, and I do urge you, all of you, to go out and do your own research. There are all kinds of organizations, including, I'll start with the United Nations, obviously very important. There are all kinds of organizations, from the United Nations to Human Rights Watch to Amnesty International to independent organizations like the Pew Research Center, and all types of organizations that do studies and keep statistics on world inequality and exploitation. You see, they may not use the term exploitation, by the way, social justice and so forth. And so you can look at these statistics on your own. I want to move on rather to Plato. Clearly, Plato is a towering figure in philosophy. I was a double major, philosophy and history, and you couldn't go on without first studying Plato before you studied anyone else. Plato lived in Athens during the decline of Athens. Athens was in decline because it had it was at war against the Lacedaemonian League, it was called, against Sparta and its allies. Athens and Sparta basically weakened each other, and in the aftermath of that, there wasn't much left of the Greek city-states. One of the reasons we see the rise of Philip of Macedon and, of course, Alexander the Great, both Macedonians. Alexander the Great, by the way, happened to be a student of Aristotle, whose works we're gonna, whose views, some of his views on equality we're going to look at today. Plato lived in the declining years of Athenian democracy, and he wrote the Republic, which is a utopian vision. The word utopia is Greek, which means no place, meaning the ideal place. That's what the word utopia means. It means no place. So some ideal place. He made up a place because he couldn't think of something that would work. He certainly was against democracy. The question is, what kind of democracy did Plato grow up in? He grew up in a society. First of all, he was an aristocrat, by the way. Plato was an aristocrat. He grew up in a society which was elitist. Women, metics, an ancient Greek word, which means non-Athenians at the time. Plato was in Athens. Non-Athenians, foreigners, they called them, in other words. A foreigner was someone who was not, did not have Athenian citizenship. They could have been from a city-state next door. Okay, as well as slaves, because Athens had, just like Sparta, a slave-based economy. There were a lot of slaves working in the city-state of Athens. Plato grew up in a society where it was a given that these people would be excluded: women, metics, and slaves. So when you take that out, who do you have left? People like Plato. You have adult male citizens. Theoretically, every adult male citizen could participate in the assembly, in the democratic government. In practice, it was people who were well-to-do, who could afford to take time off their work to go down to the Parthenon at the center of the city, the Acropolis, in Athens, and take part in the assembly. And each individual, by the way, this is called radical democracy or direct democracy. Each individual represented himself. There were no herself. There were no women allowed. So each individual represented himself. This is what Plato grew up in. However, this regime was in shambles because of war. War and the reason for war, namely the quest for markets, the quest for hegemony, political and military hegemony, and markets that the merchants in Athens wanted, brought down not just the Athenian empire, not just the Spartan League, the Lacedaemonian League, as we call it, but the entire Greek civilization, all of the Greek city-states, hence the rise of the Macedonians in the north. Plato was disillusioned with all of this. So he wrote the utopian work, The Republic, in which the ideal society is not democracy, and it's not oligarchy, and it's not tyranny, which was a form of government, by the way, in the ancient world, but a society where people like Plato, educated, wise people, were in charge of the government. They were in charge of policy. The assumption was they would make the best decisions on public policy. They would be benevolent to benefit all of society. Plato, however, did not see equality theoretically the way that modern political thinkers and political philosophers saw it. He did not view He felt, for example, he did not see women as equal. He was not as harsh toward them as Aristotle. He did not see them as equal. He also believed that slavery was natural. Although I'll just tell you a small incident that happened. It's real, of course. This actually happened to the man. He was actually caught in the ancient world. By the way, there were a lot of pirates. There was a lot of piracy throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, along the African coast, the North African coast, and the Eastern Mediterranean, modern day up here in Lebanon and Syria and the southern Aegean. There was a lot of piracy. He was caught by pirates. They immediately decided to sell him. And there were slave markets in the ancient world. Okay? So they were going to sell him. Someone recognized that this is Plato, this is an aristocrat, this is a nobleman and a philosopher. So he was actually freed. Despite that experience, which should have proved that slavery was a business. They were going to sell him for money. They were pirates. Despite that, he still maintained that slavery is natural. And he passed on that view to his pupil, to Aristotle, by the way, who actually was more practical, more well-grounded, I should say, not the idealistic. Aristotle was not the idealistic Plato. So he believed in social hierarchy, believed in inequality, made no apologies for it. Now, once you accept the concept of inequality, you have no qualms about exploiting the labor of slaves. Again, this was justified on the basis of what? Because the people who owned the slaves believed they were inferior. It was in their interest to believe they're inferior 2,500 years ago, as it was in the 18th century when the British, who were the biggest slave traders on the planet, transporting half of the slaves from Africa to the Western Hemisphere, it was in their interest to believe that they were making money. Right? So this was the situation with Plato. Now, Plato did not, one last thing, because I see I'm already running behind. I should speed this up and cut some of the material out. Plato did not believe in a society that had people who were too wealthy, because he believed that too much wealth and too much poverty, in other words, a huge gap socioeconomically, too many poor people, too few rich people, would create distortions in society. And Plato believed in harmony, in social harmony. So he was against those extremes, extreme poverty, extreme wealth. And in that sense, I suppose you can say that he had some sense of realism about that. Now, let me move on to Aristotle. Aristotle was basically accepted the same assumptions about human nature as Plato, some of the exact same assumptions about. He was harsher on women, by the way, so much so that he believed women were not just socially, but biologically inferior. In fact, he believed women were biologically flawed. Who was Aristotle to judge? To decide all of this? He decided that was that would be the way it is. Aristotle believed in the hierarchy. He believed in the in the social and political elites. He had no qualms about slavery, although, like I said, he did not. He was more grounded in realism, and he knew very well that slavery was a manufactured institution. It was an institution that made sense politically for the city states back then. It made sense for the merchants, for the people trading the slaves, for the people using the slaves. Um, it was slave labor was the cheapest. It's not free labor because you have to maintain them, otherwise they'll perish. But it was an institution based on interest, based on the interest of those owning the slaves. Um, Aristotelian thinking on hierarchy and Plato's thinking on hierarchy uh, reflects that of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. We do not have, by the way, the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire also had a huge slave owning, slave-based economy, especially in the Western, the Latin-speaking, the empire, the Latin-speaking Western part of the empire. Slave labor was ubiquitous. Through the vast estates, the latifundia system was they used them in the mines and in the in the vast estates in the area in agriculture. Um, so these two individuals reflect the ancient world. When we come to Christianity, as we transition with the fall of Rome and Saint Augustine's The City of God was a book written against the pagan Roman regime for blaming Christians insofar as there was an assumption that the Christians and Christianity and its morality undermined the loyalty of the Roman soldier, whose first duty was not to the empire, not to the Roman legion, but to the Lord Jesus Christ, to a Christian God. So with the transition toward from paganism toward monotheistic religions, we have, one would think, we should have some changes. Actually, there were changes, and Christianity, and we'll see, St. Augustine was a a towering theologian figure who, in fact, believed in spiritual egalitarianism, like the Christians did, like St. Paul did. St. Augustine was profoundly influenced by two major thinkers. One was St. Paul, who was himself influenced by Plato. His thought was influenced by Plato. And the other was Plato. St. Augustine is a Platonist theologian. I should point out, by the way, since, like I said, I did my master thesis on St. Augustine, that if you take out Greek philosophy from Christianity, what you have left is Judaism, with very few nuances to the new religion. The Christian religion was Hellenized. Greek thinkers injected pagan philosophy into this new religion. St. Paul and St. Augustine are two representatives who injected Platonism into Christianity. And of course, for Plato, it sort of fits in because the ultimate force in the universe for Plato is what he called the good, God. For Aristotle, the one, God, monotheism. So you can see, we'll see, for in the case of Aristotle, it comes later with St. Thomas Aquinas, by the way. St. Thomas Aquinas is the one who injects Aristotelianism into Christianity. In any case, St. Augustine was a pagan from North Africa, by the way. I believe Algeria. He converted late in life after living a life of sin, as he wrote in a work that's not as famous as, or maybe it is as famous as The City of God, but it's called Confessions. Saint Augustine believed in original sin. And in original sin, those who are familiar, the party of Adam and Eve, of the two parties, it's Eve that's deemed as the temptress who persuaded Adam to violate the will of God. By the way, eating the apple, I want to make sure people understand, for theologians, eating the apple is nice, it's tasty, was not the issue. The issue was that God gave everything to Adam and Eve and requested that they stay away from that tree. The issue was the violation of the will of God by the creatures that were created by God. That's the issue, not the apple. So the issue of violating the will of the Creator is the essence of sin for St. Augustine and for Christian theologians. Now, St. Augustine did not have a positive view of women any more than Plato or Aristotle. And St. Augustine accepted the social, despite writing this monumental work. I believe he started in 413 AD, obviously, and finished it 13 years later in 426. The City of God is this apologia, this defense of Christianity as the religion that did not undermine, because the Roman Empire was not responsible for the fall of Rome, because there are two cities: the city of man, the Roman Empire, the temporal city, which obviously falls. It's a city of sin. Of course, it's going to fall. And then there is the eternal city, the city of God. That's the one he wrote about. He accepted egalitarianism. He accepted equality of all people, including women, at the spiritual level only. Said nothing, wanted nothing to do with the city of man, the temporal city. That's the city of sin. That was beyond salvation. Human beings, in other words, should seek eternal salvation, spiritual salvation, not focus on the city of man. His views have been, were and still are, very, very important in the Catholic Church. Obviously, by the way, I should have pointed this out, much more influential. This is an individual, this theologian was much more influential in Western Christendom, coming during the fall of Rome, and influences especially the early Middle Ages until St. Thomas Aquinas comes along. He influences the early church profoundly, and beyond that, of course, thinkers, theologians, and philosophers beyond the medieval era. Now, I do want to point out that in the Middle Ages, there were other religions, not in the West, but in the East, that had somewhat similar views of equality and exploitation. Hinduism, I'm going to start with Hinduism, believed in the divine present that is ubiquitous in the oneness of all beings. And if you accept that, then you accept the idea that there is equality, uh, again, at the spiritual level, and there should not be discrimination or exploitation. And that the moral duty, according to Hinduism, of people is selflessness and meditation to become closer with the oneness in the universe and to experience this transcendence, spiritual transcendence. Having said that, the fact is that there was a caste system, and Hinduism did not condemn poverty. Okay. In fact, did not have anything condemnatory to say about the fact that the elites created poverty, Hindu elites, by the way, and argued that those who are in fact in the various castes and the lower castes especially, and are impoverished, should embrace poverty. Okay. So Hinduism was then used by the upper crust of Hindu society to justify inequality, as it is to this day, by the way. Okay. Just as Christianity. So this was in brief the view of egalitarianism. Egalitarianism with limits, limited to the realm of the spiritual. Islam deviates somewhat. Islam, in the aftermath of the Prophet Muhammad and those who came after the Prophet Muhammad that wrote on the doctrines of Islam, accepts the faiths, the monotheistic faiths, the Abrahamic faiths, in other words, Christianity and Judaism, accepts them. They're all these are the people of the book, the same origin, if you will. Islam accepts human beings not on the basis of differences, whether racial differences or even gender differences. Islam also accepts spiritual egalitarianism, but here's the difference. Islam, of the monotheistic religions, and including, by the way, of the one in the Indian subcontinent, namely Hinduism, and Buddhism, which comes out of Hinduism, Islam was the most tolerant of the other religions toward other faiths. In other words, religion was not used as a pretext to discriminate, to use it as a justification, as a pretext to marginalize people. So that is one issue. Does this mean that there were no hierarchies in Muslim countries, in Muslim lands, among tribes? Absolutely not. Of course, there were hierarchies. There were hierarchies, by the way, before the Prophet Muhammad, before Islam, and there were hierarchies after that. So hierarchies, social hierarchies continue. Social hierarchies continue. Um, uh, the what happens is that the religion rationalizes, if you will, it, and it creates greater tolerance toward other faiths and people. Uh, this is a very important component. One word about Confucianism in China, and I want, because I know I'm already behind a lot of this, but one thing before I go on to Confucianism. Islam also um, stressed supporting that it is a moral duty of all the faithful to support the poor. The difference here, if you notice, I said earlier that in Hinduism, the dictum, the saying was, the poor should embrace poverty. In Islam, the faithful were encouraged to help the poor. This was favorably looked upon. I should point out, by the way, that Confucianism in China was a not a formalized religion, but it became the institutional basis for the organization of society. And Confucianism was based on hierarchy, and hierarchy justified for the sake of harmony. Harmony, very important. Harmony, very important. Therefore, equality was not an issue. It was something that they frowned upon, and so Confucianism um, perpetuated and helped to preserve the hierarchical status quo, and that is throughout China. I want to move on to the later Middle Ages because we're coming up almost on the hour, and move on to St. Thomas Aquinas, and then to Niccolo Machiavelli, and Sir Thomas More, and Martin Luther. Thomas Aquinas was a towering Catholic theologian, an Aristotelian who heavily relied on Aristotelian ethics and Aristotelian logic and Aristotelian metaphysics, and infused it into Christian doctrine. Obviously, we know what Aristotle believed about hierarchies and elites and women. Well, in the Middle Ages and Christianity, the role of women was spiritual egalitarianism, but not social. The social status of women was determined by secular conventions. So theology had no role here. Theology had no role here. St. Thomas Aquinas defended the status quo. The church, by the time St. Thomas Aquinas comes on the scene, the Catholic Church in the West, the church as an institution, Western Christendom, was the largest landowner in Europe. It was a very powerful institution because there were no strong centralized states. the Vatican and the church as an institution, the most important institution in people's lives. Their lives revolved around the church. Everything from their worldview, the people had a worldview which they got from the church. There was no other source. There was no secular education. The church gave them their worldview. The church told them that they must pray and obey and live a life free of sin to secure a place in heaven. The church had become very wealthy. And it was the largest landowner of Europe. And we'll see one of the ways that the church became wealthy was through the sale of indulgences, which Martin Luther condemned, basically paying to buy remission of sin. The next figure I want to discuss very briefly is Niccolo Machiavelli, an Italian secular thinker, obviously coming in the Renaissance era and in a transition period when Europe was changing from the medieval feudal manorial system toward the market economy, toward commercial capitalism, in other words, the commercial revolution. Niccolo Machiavelli comes along and provides a political philosophy that actually justifies authoritarianism. And basically, he tried to portray all of this as practical, pragmatic, arguing that human beings are essentially devious, untrustworthy, and likely more prone to do the wrong thing than to do the right thing. Obviously, they carry the seed of evil in them through Adam and Eve. Christian assumption was that human beings, obviously in the West, carry the seeds of evil in them, or sin, passed down to them. Therefore, and they have to prove themselves to secure a place in paradise. Therefore, they need a type of government that reflects who they are. They don't need a benevolent government. They need a government that is strong, that doesn't necessarily tell the truth, that is in fact a government that is there to preserve the status quo. Machiavelli advocated that that society, which in his time was made up of landowners, merchants, bankers, workers and farmers and peasants, society is hierarchical and didn't question it. He obviously believed, as did thinkers before him, that this was natural. A contemporary of Machiavelli, Sir Thomas More, experiencing the exact same conditions, more or less the exact same conditions in the transition from the feudal manorial economy to merchant capitalism in England, however, not in Italy. Sir Thomas More wrote a book called Utopia, the ancient Greek word which means no place, the ideal place. And in that book, Sir Thomas More writes against exploitation, against inequality. However, he lived in the early 16th century, and he did not have modern day views about women, or even the views of his contemporary Thomas Müntzer of women. He felt they were inferior. So, although Sir Thomas More's Utopia is a precursor to the modern socialist, even communist in some sense, um, vision of society, his ultimate goal was that exploitation was evil, and that he foresaw that with capitalism, and this, remembers, Thomas More lived during the transition period of capitalism, and he saw very clearly that was what was coming was the more thorough exploitation of people. He was against it. He was a devout Catholic who believed in egalitarianism, by the way, at the spiritual level, but also believed that that's the ideal government, hence the term utopia, the utopian government, the perfect government, should make sure that such exploitation doesn't take place here on earth. A contemporary of his, and this is the last person I'll discuss, and then we'll end it and continue part two tomorrow, beginning with Thomas Müntzer, also a contemporary of both Luther and Thomas More. Martin Luther was a German theologian and university professor, and a monk. He was in the clergy. His ultimate goal was to bring about the purity of the church back the way it was meant to be when the early church started out. He, to his credit, he saw enormous corruption from the Vatican on down. He saw that the church was more hypocritical and more materialistic than any institution. No matter what they were preaching about spiritual salvation, they were swimming in materialism. One of the popes, a contemporary pope in Luther's time, apparently said, God gave us all these goods, material goods. By all means, let us enjoy them. So we have, Luther did visit Rome, by the way. He did see for himself the luxury of the upper clergy, cardinals, bishops, archbishops, all the way up to the Pope. The way they lived, these people were very close to the aristocracy, was sinful. Nothing to do with spiritual quest. They were swimming in materialism. However, they were preaching morality and abstinence and spiritual purity to the flock, to the faithful, while they were enjoying the goods of this earth. Luther was interested in reforming the church. He is the first reformer, church reformer theologian, who lashed out in his 95 Theses, a major work. He lashed out at the Catholic Church for its corruption, for its hypocrisy, for its materialism. One other thing that bothered him was that the church was preaching that you can actually buy salvation. You're too weak, you're too tempted, temptation is getting to you. Well, guess what? We will sell indulgences. Indulgences were sold, meaning for the right price, you can buy a bit of salvation, a bit of heaven. Luther came out against indulgences, obviously. can't buy salvation. Clearly, you can if you're wealthy. Um, and he also lashed out at the idea that the Catholic Church, this is a major doctrine of the Catholic Church, and this is a fundamental difference between the Protestant reformers versus the Catholics. This is a doctrinal difference, is that the way to secure salvation is through deeds rather than faith in God. Luther, despite his egalitarianism, and I must admit, by the way, and I remember I had a German professor when I took a course on Luther, and I was enthusiastic about Luther. I thought, oh my God, an egalitarian. And my German professor said, oh, well, everybody acts like that. But if you read on, you'll find out, he cautioned me, that he wasn't so egalitarian. In fact, that is exactly right. Luther was egalitarian only insofar as he wanted to reform the institution of the church. And he was interested in the spiritual salvation of the faith. He was adamantly against any change in the political status quo, in the social status quo, in the economic status quo. In fact, he lived during a period when there was inflation in the as rents for property and farms were going up because landowners were converting from subsistence agriculture to commercial agriculture, so land values were going up. So there was an increase in the cost of living throughout Europe, and especially in Germany. So what happens in the 1520s, in the mid-1520s, there was a German war, a peasants' war, it's called the German Peasants' War, an uprising. Luther sided with the elites, the German nobility, and the German bishops and archbishops who were supporting the nobility, adamantly against egalitarianism, adamantly against any sort of any sign of ending exploitation of these poor people who were living through, obviously, if they were, imagine early 16th century, people were very docile, by the way. People were obedient to the Catholic Church. They would not raise arms against the institutions unless they were desperate, and they were desperate. Luther suggested that they go out to the elites. He sided with elites. Kill them, execute them, cut off their heads. He used very strong language against the people. Very strong language. Adamantly against equality, against exploitation. This was a situation where he could have argued, wait a minute, these are the same people that whose souls I'm trying to save. But he only wanted to save their souls, not their bodies, suffering through this transition that made life very difficult for them, material life very difficult for them. However, one of his contemporaries, who was influenced by Luther, just as I was when I was an undergraduate, namely Thomas Mutzer, and we'll talk about him. We'll start with him in the next session. Thomas Mutzer actually said, wait a minute. Why are we making a distinction between the spiritual aspect of human nature and the material? It's the same person. I have a spiritual side, but I have a body, I'm me. I have to eat to survive. Yeah, well, Thomas Mutzer, Luther knows that better than anybody, right? So so Thomas Munzer adopted a different strategy, a different worldview, and becomes the head of the revolution that Luther wanted to crush, to stop egalitarianism, to stop this movement toward equality, to stop social justice, and to strengthen, to make sure that the secular elites, the nobility at the time, the German nobility, by the way, the upper clergy, although he had condemned it for being materialistic and hypocritical, for being immersed in materialism, right? He sided with them. I'm going to end it there. I will continue part two tomorrow. And part two, we will start with Thomas Munzer, and we'll move on to John Locke, the English philosopher, to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the French philosopher, Marx and Engels, the people who really took this issue on head on in the mid 19th century during the revolutions, the European revolutions of 1848. That's when the Communist Manifesto coincides, the publication coincides with the revolutions of 1848. And then we'll move on down to our times and neoliberals like Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman from the University of Chicago. So thank you for listening. Please write comments, join the channel, Asad Alim's channel, he does an excellent job here. And thank you for listening. And we will continue tomorrow. Thank you.